Today we're going to discuss Rabbi Lamm's article, and not just article, but his worldview about the relationship between the legal tradition, what we'll call the Halachic tradition, the law model, and the non-law model in the Jewish tradition, what we call the Agadic tradition. And Rabbi Lamm, as many of the eulogists have observed, was a darshan. He was a person who not only was a thoughtful philosopher and a fine done halachicist, he was also a comfortable sermon provider and a homilist of some regard. He gave sermons, then he wrote them down, and there are hundreds and hundreds of Rabbi Lamm's sermons. And they've now been turned into books. There are now, I think, 9 books of Rabbi Lamm's sermons. Each of them is very interesting. I just purchased, because it just came out, Torah Beloved, which is Rabbi Lamm's book of Shavuos sermons relating to the holiday of Pentecost, of weeks. But Rabbi Lamm was a wonderful reader of the Jewish tradition, even outside of law. And it's worth understanding when a scholar stops and spends a considerable amount of their intellectual energy in a scholarly field that most of us view as unworthy of the kind of intense scholarship that the scholar provides, you ask, why? Why are you doing this? Because scholarly people spend their time on scholarly agendas. And Rabbi Lamm clearly perceived drush, the Agadic tradition, the delivering of homilies, to be an integral part of what was important for him to do. And he did it regularly, not only when he was a synagogue rabbi at the Jewish Center, but even he continued this practice throughout his many years at Yeshiva University. And it's simply important to recognize that Rabbi Lamm perceived law and I'm not even sure what's the right word for, maybe it's homilies or sermons, to serve 2 distinctly different purposes in the Jewish tradition. And he thought that they were both important. And I just always find that when a serious person spends their time on something, that reminds me that this activity is more serious than I thought it should be, because serious people spend their time on serious things, and maybe there's something here that I didn't understand or appreciate how worthwhile and serious it is. So I guess, to some extent, as I've reread Rabbi Lamm's material, in anticipation of this lecture, I reread 2 books of his sermons, and I reread his famous article, Notes of an Unrepentant Darshan, the notes of a person who regularly gives sermons. And I reread them both, and I want to fit it into a very interesting genre. And this goes back to my most basic read of what Rabbi Lamm was as a scholar. I perceive Rabbi Lamm as, throughout his life, doing 4 things. He was himself a scholar, an author of many books and important articles, as we've seen. He was a religious leader who perceived very much part of his job to be to inspire people in the religious direction. He was a communal leader in the sense of he perceived himself as building the community in a political, institutional way, both in the sense of Yeshiva University and in the sense of tradition and in the sense of camps. And in the sense of so much more, Rabbi Lamm perceived his role not just to be as a religious leader, but as a communal leader. And finally, Rabbi Lamm perceived himself, and I now use the term all the time here, as an intellectual diplomat, a person who seeks to harmonize competing schools of thought in a worthwhile way so as to explain how competing ideas can live in a nuanced universe without necessarily adjudicating that this idea is right and this idea is wrong. And Rabbi Lamm here, in the article I shared with you in the chat box and also sent out by email, certainly continues this policy. Rabbi Lamm is well aware at the time that he's writing, the mid-1980s, that among rabbinical students at Yeshiva University, and not just at Yeshiva University, but everywhere, the job of the rabbi was slowly shifting from a person who gave sermons Saturday morning and was a social worker to a community to a religious leader enmeshed in Jewish law, halacha, and not just a person who stood up Saturday mornings and gave sermons, or even gave sermons in other circumstances. Rabbi Lamm stops in the 1980s, and in a few different times and in a few different settings, stops to voice his uncomfortableness with that model. He stops to say, I'm saddened by and uncomfortable with the fact that rabbis have given up on the homiletic aspects of the rabbinate. And I, Rabbi Lamm says, think that being able to deliver important matters, not necessarily through the rubric of law, halacha, but through the rubric of homily, is an important skill that the rabbinic tradition should continue, and it's an important skill that rabbis should have, and it's an idea that I'm committed to teaching. But more importantly, Rabbi Lamm lays out a theory of why legal systems need a non-legal method of communication. And this is a very important idea that Rabbi Lamm stops a few different times to address and represents a valuable contribution to Jewish philosophy and the Jewish tradition. Rabbi Lamm is visibly bothered by a question, and it's a question that I would have thought would be much more prominently discussed, but it's really not. Rabbi Lamm is bothered by the question that anybody who learns Talmud sees that a hefty percentage of the Talmud, this magisterial document of Jewish law, spends its time on non-law matters. It tells stories, it gives homilies, it recounts events, it delves into a variety of important matters that are not what we would consider in any way, shape, or form law. Not legal. That's exactly right, Elliot. Not at all legal. And anybody who's learned Talmud knows that while there are a few places where the Talmud spends page after page discussing law, most of the Talmud is a mixture of homily and law, and they mix in an intertwined way. And Rabbi Lamm wants to, in this article and in a few other articles that he wrote, ask the question of why would the Jewish tradition use as its touchstone a document that contains so much, Michael Broyde is going to say, nonsense. And Rabbi Lamm answers that you see from this, that this material is not nonsense. Not only is it not nonsense, it's extremely important material that the Talmudic rabbis understood was an important way to relate to the Jewish tradition, and that it was wrong, a mistake, it was a mistake to shrug this material off as relatively unimportant and not valuable. And Rabbi Lamm, a few different times, expresses some uncomfortableness with a group of Rishonim who shrug off the Agadic material, meaning the basic style of the Rif, Rabbi Alfasi, from 1,100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, really, was to cross out the Agadic material. It wasn't relevant. And when he published his work of Jewish law, he crossed it all out. And Maimonides, the Rambam, more or less continues that style. But it's worth noting, as Rabbi Lamm points out, that Rashi and Rashi's disciples treat the homiletic material in the Talmud with the same degree of seriousness that they treat the law material. Rashi writes a commentary on the homiletic material, on the Agadic material, with the same seriousness that he writes it on the legal material. And Tosafos, Rashi's intellectual and physical descendant, continue that practice of commenting on the Agadic material with no question of its importance. This is different than, for example, the Rif and the Rambam, or even Nachmanides, the Ramban, who says in one of his own homilies that the homiletic material of the rabbis was like the sermons delivered by the king. If you didn't like it, pay no attention to it, and it's not really important or binding. Rabbi Lamm here stops to frontally address why he thinks homiletic material serves an extremely important role in a system of religious philosophy. And like our previous 5 topics, Rabbi Lamm reverts to his basic idea, which is the purpose of the Jewish tradition is to teach us how to relate to God. And homilies, Agadata, drush, all serve the basic purpose of providing another aspect in our relationship with the Almighty. And I want to review sort of what he says, and then I want to comment on it. Rabbi Lamm opens with a concession. Rabbi Lamm says that he acknowledges that homilies are less analytical. And not only that, but he acknowledges that homilies are at some level less important than law. He thinks that law is, in the end, the glue that holds the Jewish tradition together, and that if we didn't have a legal system that undergirds what we're doing, ultimately the Jewish tradition would collapse. Justice Holmes puts it in a way that Rabbi Lamm would appreciate, although he never quotes. Holmes says that ultimately it is the legal tradition that is turned to resolve all disputes of theology, meaning that homilies serve a role in framing matters for law. Rabbi Lamm would exactly 100% agree with that, but he would acknowledge that law is the base upon which the Jewish tradition resides for resolving matters of practical conduct. But Rabbi Lamm then stops to advance 5 very important points, or at least of the 5 points he advances, 4 are very important. The first, he says with a smile on his face, but he means it. He says as follows: having raised a generation of lawyers, Rabbi Lamm says, who will call Roshei Yeshiva, people who spend their time dealing with law, it turns out that the people who deal with law aren't very good at dealing with homilies. As they say, here's the basic rule. If you're really, really, really good with a hammer, everything is a nail, because the hammer is the only tool you know how to use, so you use it. The Roshei Yeshiva that are around him, he says, tend to be very, very, very good with law, And since they're very, very, very good with law, they tend to treat everything as a legal problem, because if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. Rabbi Lamm notes that this itself is an important failing. It's true that if all you have is a hammer, then everything is a nail, but that's not a defense, Rabbi Lamm would say, of the failing to train yourself in only one tool. Rabbi Lamm thinks that sophisticated people they not only are sophisticated in how they use their tools, they're sophisticated in their selection of tools, and that smart people have 6 different tools in their toolbox. Not only are they smart in terms of how they use their tools, they're smart in terms of which tool do they pick up. And I'll share with you a story. In 1998, I was the director of the Beth Din of America, and an incident involving Rabbi Lamm came up with another Rosh Yeshiva of a prominent institution who said something about Rabbi Lamm that most of us thought was slanderous. And I wrote Rabbi Lamm a letter on my Beth Din of America stationery saying that, dear Rabbi Lamm, in light of these statements, I think that you should start a legal proceeding against this person for slander, and that in a rabbinical court, in a Beit Din, you would win. And Rabbi Lamm called me up to discuss with me why I thought that conclusion of Jewish law, and we discussed it for a little bit, and he said, thank you. And then I imagined he would open a case and we would proceed, and he never called me back. So eventually I bumped into him and I asked him, why didn't you proceed? And he said, upon reflection and conversation and thought, he realized that while law was one tool to solve the problem that he was in, or the dispute he was in, it was not the right tool for this situation, and he was going to address it differently, and he did, by the way. And he was correct. And my suggestion, while true, in a sense of I thought he would win in a rabbinical court and emerge triumphant, with hindsight, I recognize that Rabbi Lamm's tool was better than the one I proposed. And it reflected the fact that at that stage in my life, I knew how to use only a hammer. And if you only know how to use a hammer, everything is a nail. And Rabbi Lamm realized, he was many years older than me always. At that, he must have been in his 60s then. That he had a better tool at hand, and that everybody who's only good with hammers has a nail. Those of us who are experts in law, we tend to analyze every problem through the rubric of law, but law isn't everything. The second thing Rabbi Lamm says, which is very important, is ideological identity is less well established in homily than in law. And that if you want to reach communities outside of your own, you would be well served learning to deliver homilies, because homilies cross borders and boundaries in ways that when you hear law from somebody outside your legal system, you just shrug it off. Whereas homilies, moral messages, are more universalistic and tend to cross boundaries. This is definitely true not only in Judaism, but in politics as well. Politicians who are able to deliver homilies cross audiences readily. Rabbi Lamm intuits this, that rabbis who want to serve more than their narrow self-selected community they'll learn to deliver homilies that deliver messages in thoughtful ways. The fourth thing Rabbi Lamm says is the written word has certain natural limitations which the spoken word doesn't have. And there are lots of things, Rabbi Lamm liked to say, that are worth saying that are not worth publishing. And by the way, Rabbi Lamm was very insistent later on in life as the world moved to the model of recording everything and posting it on the internet, that he frequently did not want to be recorded, and it wasn't a good way to relate to the world, that the written word had a very important purpose. The spoken word had a very important purpose, but the spoken word posted on YouTube somehow developed some characteristics like writing, and that was sometimes very problematic because things that were appropriate for speaking weren't always appropriate for posting on YouTube. Rabbi Lamm thought that was an important loss in our society. I, by the way, have accepted that. I post very few lectures. I like writing. I actually don't mind giving sermons. I've given my fair share of sermons in the world, some of them very good, some of them fine, some of them okay, and some of them downright horrible. I understand that. But I rarely post sermons. I mostly write when I want to say something, and the written word serves as a method of communication. Rabbi Lamm's point is that sermons tend to serve the audience in front of you, and it allows you some intellectual flexibility to address the particular universe that you're talking to, whereas the written word is perpetual and forever and will be read by people who are in a different time and a different place, and thus come with many more caveats and require much more finessing. It's much easier to speak to a particular audience than it is to write to a particular audience. And Rabbi Lamm bemoaned our tendency to turn the spoken word into permanent ideas that are communicated on the internet forever. And finally, Rabbi Lamm expresses some reserved criticism of both Rabbi Chaim Volozhin and maybe even Rabbi Soloveitchik, his teacher, for their overemphasis on intellectualism or on a certain kind of presentation of ideas. Now, Rabbi Lamm notes that actually Rabbi Soloveitchik didn't fit this way at all, because he was both very comfortable in the world of law and also very, very, very comfortable in the world of homily, but he became famous for his observations in the world of law, and people forgot the fact that he was an excellent homilist. But now, when you Rabbi Lamm then lays out his general idea of, so what do we gain by having a homiletic tradition? And I want to read parts of it from the article I posted to you, and I want to give a color commentary as I read it. Rabbi Lamm is speaking now, not Michael Broyde. I feel most strongly that drush, homily, is an integral part of the authentic Jewish experience, that it remains and will indeed become even more significant as a medium of religious communication with our Jews in the years to come. Rabbi Lamm here is making the following claim. Law is a way of instructing people who are already committed what is the right thing. But homily is a way of expressing an authentic Jewish experience to people who are on the outside of this Jewish experience and who are yearning to figure out if this experience is worthwhile. It is true, Rabbi Lamm continues, of course, that Judaism is unthinkable without halakha, meaning that the basis of how we conduct ourselves, this is Michael Broyde talking rather than Rabbi Lamm, is grounded in a law base, and that if you took away the law base, Judaism would be unthinkable. But it is equally inconceivable without Agada, homilies, and machshava, philosophy, and drush, moral reasoning independent of the law. After all, what is life without poetry? Drush, Rabbi Lamm continues, homilies have been ubiquitous throughout the history of Rabbinic Judaism and is coextensive with it. There is no reason for authentic drush, homily, not to serve a creative function for our times as well. Meaning, Rabbi Lamm's point here goes as follows. While there is a base in the Jewish tradition called law, the idea that there's a base called law doesn't also mean that there's a ceiling called law, and that both stories and philosophy and homilies serve a basic moral purpose throughout the Jewish tradition of inspiring people to move above the letter of the law and to profess greater fidelity to the law. It is fortunate that more people want to learn today and that they recognize the spiritual hegemony of halakha, of law, although there remains thousands of members of Orthodox synagogues whose knowledge is still quite limited and compares inadequately either to their aspirations or pretenses. But people not only want to know, they, B'nai Torah, learned people, as well as ordinary balabatim, typical congregants, also seek to be inspired and motivated. Rabbi Lamm's point here goes as follows. Law is intrinsically limited. Law is limited because it preaches only to the people who know they want to obey it before they open a law book. And you cannot inspire somebody to obey the law merely by repeating to them what the law is. The inspiration to obey law, what Rabbi Lamm called to be inspired and motivated, you have to do that not through recitation of the law, but through the philosophical, homiletic, and sermonic tradition in the Jewish way. And that's always been an idea that's coextensive with Rabbinic Judaism. This is, by the way, consistent with Rabbi Lamm's deep ideological belief that the Jewish tradition simultaneously talks to insiders and outsiders all the time, and that central to what the Jewish tradition is to do is to simultaneously talk to those who already believe and those who do not yet believe, to inspire the believers to remain steadfast and to inspire the outsiders to join the team. Rabbi Lamm is insistent that the idea, 2 of his volumes of works are called The 70 Faces of Torah, 70 Faces, that the 70 Faces is a reference to the 70 languages, to the idea that there are 70 different languages out there, which Rabbi Lamm understands to mean there's a universalism in the Jewish tradition that requires that we talk to the outsiders. And Rabbi Lamm is insistent that the only language that talks to outsiders is the language of philosophy, homily, and sermon. Outsiders are not persuaded of the correctness of the system by a recitation of its rules. I cannot persuade you that the Constitution is good by reading the Constitution to you. I have to persuade you that the Constitution is good by reading the Federalist Papers to you, which is closer to Agadata and Drush. Or I have to read Montesquieu or Locke. Rabbi Lamm's point is that law is utterly incapable of self-validating. It speaks very nicely to the people who already believe in law, but I can no more persuade you of the validity of American law by reading to you American law than I can by explaining to you the validity of Jewish law by reading to you the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. This is extremely, extremely important. And then he quotes the famous Sifri, a Talmudic commentary on the Bible itself, on the Torah itself. If you want to know God, through whose word the world was created, study Agadata, study the homilies, because thus we will get to know God and obey him. Rabbi Lamm's point is that law doesn't validate the divine. Law flows from the commitment to obey, and the commitment to obey is derived from the Agadic homiletic tradition and not at all from the legal tradition. Rabbi Lamm likes to note that the highlight of the homiletic tradition to this very day is 4 or 5 different events in America that don't at all reflect on law. I heard Rabbi Lamm say that if you want to think about this, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is a sermon. It doesn't encapsulate any law at all. It's a sermon. Sermons motivate people to be law obedient. Law doesn't motivate people to be law obedient. Law obedience is what happens when you hear a good sermon. And Roosevelt's fireside chats fit into the same way. It's so important to understand. And Washington's sermon in the Tavern on the Green, all of these, Rabbi Lamm points out, are what built the Republic. The Republic isn't built by law. The Republic is built by homily, and law flows from people's commitment to the law because they like the homily. Rabbi Lamm is persuaded, and I think so am I, that this basic model is correct. Homilies persuade outsiders to become insiders, and homilies, ideas, persuade people that they should be law obedient. Let me go even further and express an idea that Rabbi Lamm doesn't express, but which I think is correct. Homilies remind people of the need to obey laws that in specificity they might not agree with. Meaning the Jewish tradition is full of laws that people look up and say, oh, I don't agree with this law and I don't agree with that law and I wish this one would change. And Rabbi Lamm's point is, how do you get people to obey legal rules that in specificity they don't agree with? And the answer is you do that by inspiring them to believe in the system as the whole. The system as the whole is a very, very, very important idea. And Rabbi Lamm likes to use homily as a way to explain not why people agree with a specific rule that I can logically defend, but rather it explains why people want to join into a system that they might not agree with this law and they might not agree with that law. That commitment comes through homily. That commitment does not come through law itself. Countless people in the rabbinic tradition have expressed to me the following idea. I'm inside the rabbinic tradition, even though I don't agree with this pronouncement or that pronouncement, because on the whole, I'm deeply committed. And I can live in a legal system where I like 98% of the law, because on the whole, I believe that this is the word of God, even though I'm somewhat befuddled why God would word it this way. And if I were God, I wouldn't do this. And that this is a very important observation. Rabbi Lamm says that that comes from homily and not from law. Elliot, you look like you wanted to ask something.
Oh, I did?
You did, yes, because your light was going on and off.
Oh, I didn't mean to do that, but I was thinking, did Rabbi Lamm feel like in the rabbinic teaching, I mean, the education of the rabbi, that there should be more emphasis outside of Gemara on other things and other skills for the rabbi?
Yes, that was Rabbi Lamm's basic view was that the rabbinic curriculum should focus more time on homily than it was in the mid-'80s, less time on homily than it was in the 50s, but more time on homily than it was in the mid-'80s. Rabbi Lamm thinks that homily is a central way to relate to the world. And I'll say something as follows. I heard Rabbi Lamm in the 2000s express the idea that Chabad has figured this out and that they are to outsiders not through, but through homily, and that this was a worthwhile skill that Rabbi Lamm thought we should have as well. And thus Rabbi Lamm is making here three basic contributions that are worth repeating, and then I want to focus on the last one of them. Law, Jewish law, halacha, is important. And he concedes 3 different times in the article that Jewish law is the base and the foundation, and you can't function without it. But it's not the whole thing, and should never be the whole thing, and that the Jewish tradition recognizes that there are many different aspects of the relationship to God, and homily, philosophy, and storytelling are central to the various ways we relate to God. The second thing Rabbi Lamm thought was a skills observation, and Rabbi Lamm made the skills observation a few different times. People, even great rabbis, tend to confuse everything for a nail if all they own is a hammer. And it's important to give people, rabbis particularly, many different tools to relate to many different circumstances. Rabbi Lamm mentioned this theme as well in our previous lecture on extraterrestrial life, where Rabbi Lamm bemoans what he calls the fallacy of transferred authority, which is people who are great at law think that because they're great at law, they become great at other things, or people who are great physicists think they're great philosophers. And the truth is that if you want to have rabbis who are great sermon providers, you have to teach them how to do sermons, and that you don't naturally learn to be an excellent sermon provider merely because you teach them how to do law well. And that's a very, very, very important observation. The third one, which is one that I really want to focus on, is Rabbi Lamm's insistence that you can only motivate people to keep the law with homily and sermons and stories, and not with the law itself. Rabbi Lamm here provides a theory of outreach that the older I get, the more persuaded I am is true. People do not join a legal system because they read the law books. People join a legal system because
inspired.
They're inspired. That's correct, because their heart is touched and they see the majesty of the whole thing, and that persuades people to obey the legal rules, even if they might not agree with them all. And Rabbi Lamm here hits upon something very, very important. As we spend more and more of our time and energy discussing Jewish law, we run the risk of engaging in outreach and not outreach. And by the way, you're hearing from somebody who spends a lot of his time discussing Jewish law. I like discussing Jewish law. It's my favorite topic because it's a nail and I have a hammer. But Rabbi Lamm's point is that you have to be aware of the fact that the hammer called Jewish law has real limitations. Its real limitations is it speaks only to people who are already in, and that people don't come in because of the law. They might obey the law once they're inside, but they come in because of a homily or a sermon or a deeply motivating, beautiful story, or of an experience in life, either of their own or of somebody else that's shared with them, which is a sermon. And Rabbi Lamm here really articulates a grand theory of what keeps people from joining religion and what makes people want to join the Jewish tradition. Rabbi Lamm thinks the incessant focus on halacha within orthodoxy ultimately prevents people from joining the community because nobody is motivated to join by halacha. People observe halacha and they stay in the community because of halacha, but they don't join because of it. And the second thing Rabbi Lamm says that I think is really true is that if you want people to have multifaceted skills and be experts in more than one aspect of Judaism, you have to teach it. And Rabbi Lamm liked to note that smicha students, rabbinical students at Yeshiva University, could spend their whole day studying law, but they also were allowed in the afternoons to, instead of studying law, study philosophy from 3 o'clock onward, or study homilies, or what they called Machshevet Yisrael, which I'll broadly say is homilies within the Jewish tradition. There were a variety of ways that you could become an excellent rabbi. And Rabbi Lamm thought that they were all in existence at one time. And the more skills a person had, the better off you are. You couldn't be radically deficient in law, but you need not think that law is the only tool. It's not true. Law is one of many tools, and the more tools you have in your toolbox, the more likely you are to pick up the right tool. The Blumenthals ask, how does homily preaching influence law? So that's a doctoral dissertation rather than a lecture. There are moments where homilies influence law, and there are moments where law influences homilies, but that's not for now. That's for a law class, and we're not giving a law class right now. I still painfully feel Rabbi Lamm's loss. I recognize Rabbi Lamm consistently provided a greatness to our community that's easy to miss. I recognize as we spend our 10 classes reviewing him, we see so much from His Majesty. Here, Rabbi Lamm returns to his model of being an intellectual diplomat. What do I mean by that? He synthesizes the homiletic tradition and the legal tradition and explains that they're both part of the Jewish tradition, that you shouldn't say I do one or the other. Everybody needs to understand that to have a successful community, you need to do both. And that this is consistent with Rabbi Lamm's basic view as an intellectual diplomat, which is a person who looks two good ideas in the eye and says, well, at first glance, these two good ideas are incompatible. In fact, they are compatible, and shows you how. That is exactly what Rabbi Lamm did here. And it reminds me of the fact that there's a reason why the last half of the 20th century should be known in my community as the Lamm years. It's because the intellectual diplomat among us synthesized radically different ideas and radically different approaches to one whole that was beautiful and better than each of the ideas individually. Thank you all very much, and we'll sort of call the roll and see how everybody's doing, and we'll meet again on Wednesday for contemporary halacha, because now and all I've got is a hammer. And next Sunday for our next and seventh class in memory of Rabbi Lamm. Blumenthals?
I think I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily. That is, we lean on Passover as a sign of freedom, and the question of whether women, who are not normally, as I understand it, obligated to observe that commandment, in this case, really should be obligated because of the homiletic status of the dignity of women.
Okay.
This is not a case where something crucial is at stake, but it seems to me that this is a case where homily certainly influences law. And I think you have, but I don't, the ability to give us at least one example of where homily does influence a case in which the law itself is ambiguous.
I don't understand. To me, I totally agree with you, but it seems to me that, homilies serve an occasional role. You've picked one out, and it definitely sometimes motivates us l'chumra, and that's worth thinking about. We'd have to collect many more examples to think about. I'm not prepared to address it here. That's the honest answer. So you can press me, but I'm not prepared to address it here because I don't know exactly how to think about it in a structured, coherent way. We'd have to look at more examples and think harder about it.
Rabbi Lamm didn't do that?
Nope.
No. Okay.
No. Tzvi, how are you doing?
Perfect. Thank you so much. Very interesting subject that you raised. Very
Good.
important. It's very important.
Very important. Lisa, how are you doing?
Good. I have a question. I came in a little late, so maybe you already did this, but I'm thinking of what's a good example in the Talmud. I'm thinking of doing Daf Yomi, and there's all these stories interspersed with halacha, but which stories are like homilies and which stories are just to illustrate the halacha? And can you give me an example from, let's say, recent Daf Yomi that would be a homily?
No. I'm going to confess, I give Daf Yomi every day, and I give it and I forget. So I'm not going to pick anything from Daf, because I give Daf Yomi every morning, and I don't file it away among the things that I need to remember. But generally, the Talmud is sometimes full of stories that directly relate to the law at hand, but the Talmud spends 7 pages in Chagiga. You'll come to it next year doing Daf Yomi, discussing matters of Jewish philosophy from a homiletic way. And the Talmud spends pages and pages discussing homilies. Sometimes the Talmud in Psachim spends pages discussing astrological phenomena. Sometimes the Talmud in Megillah discusses homilies relating to the Purim story. The Talmud freely goes homiletic, and it doesn't always relate to the law under discussion at all. Sometimes it's sort of, while we're discussing this, we'll quote something from the same great rabbi who discusses something else. The Talmud vectors in a few different ways. One way it vectors is, I'll tell you a story about the law we're discussing, but another way it vectors is it says, we're discussing Rabbi X, let me tell you a story about Rabbi X. So, this is a longer conversation as well, but there's no doubt at all that the Talmud is littered with Agadic material. The conventional estimate is it's a third. Might be a little bit less, actually, because Lisa astutely observes that maybe the stories that illustrate the law aren't really Agadata. If that's the case, then it's about 20%. But it's still a number. When I look at the United States Constitution and ask how much of it is Agadata, how much of it is homilies or Jewish, the answer is very little. There's very, very, very little. And when you ask how much homilies are there in the law codes of the state of Georgia, not much. Not much. Every once in a while there is, but not much. Susie, you're doing well?
I am. I have a question. Do homilies change over the generations?
Sure. Sure. The homilies sometimes change. Sure. Sure, of course. Homilies have maybe a greater sense of change than anything else. Homilies sort of are less bound by law.
Right.
So,
thank you.
Judge Beasley, how are you doing?
Fine, and I hope you are too. I
Doing
do have
very
a
well.
question. I think you said there
Please.
are six tools. The law, was that right? 6? The law, homilies, storytelling, philosophy, and then there would be 2 more?
Well, I didn't spend a lot of time on it here. There's mysticism. Rabbi Lamm observes I've totally left out the mystical tradition from this conversation just because there are limits to what a person can do in 45 minutes. There's a mystical tradition which heads at problems from a totally different perspective. And then there's what I will call a secondary law tradition, which is law sometimes runs on 2 tracks, which is what is the ideal and what is the minimum. Maybe I'll spend some time another time discussing the difference between maximal law and minimal law. It's a very important observation in the Jewish tradition.
Somewhere along the way, did you talk about morality and ideology?
I did, but I think morality and ideology, Rabbi Lamm would subsume under philosophy.
Okay.
And so I didn't consciously articulate them. And I'm grateful for Elliot, who told me he liked the class. I'm always Oh,
I like them all, really.
thank you very much. I enjoy,
Yeah.
flattery will get you nothing, but it is very much appreciated. That's the truth.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Elliot. It made my day just to see the thumbs up. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Michael.
We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you,
night. Have a
Michael.
good
Bye,
week,
Susie. Bye, everybody.
everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.